Hi, everyone. Today, R.N. Roveleh and I, who are both writers, are going to be reviewing and analyzing Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness novella. Published in 1899, this novella is widely seen as a critique of European colonialism in Africa. It also examines truth, morality, and power dynamics. To explore these themes, we will be asking various questions, starting with, what prompted you to read this book? For me, one of the reasons I started reading this book was because I remembered that you, R.N. Roveleh, were inspired by the character of Kurtz from this book, specifically your character of Yngvar. I have long heard of this book, but I didn't bother to read it, even though it's been sitting on my shelf since 2016. I think the writing style really put me off since it was so flowery and hard to understand.
Right. Yes, I really was inspired by Kurtz, and he is a fantastic character, and we're going to get to him in a few moments. The reason why I wanted to read this book is also the reason for which I find Joseph Conrad immensely inspirational for me. He wasn't a native English speaker. He was only fluent in his 20s, and yet he became one of the most acclaimed writers of English literature who is renowned, among other things, for the depth of the language used. That's a tremendous achievement, and he stands as proof that great writing doesn't depend on language in the sense that many people believe. Language use is a skill that can be learned, and literature also means concept, structure, character building, human nature, things that don't rely on language. As a Romanian who writes in English, Conrad's books are motivational for me in this sense, and not only.
Mm-hmm. Second question is, what is the book about? Essentially, this is a flashback where English seaman Charles Marlo talks about his travels in Africa. He has always been fascinated by the blank spaces on maps. As such, he applies to work for the company, a large ovary trading organization working out of the Congo. As Charles sails up the river, he sees the brutality of colonialism, with many natives being forced to build railroads. He also hears about Mr. Kurtz from the manager of the company, a trader of ovary who is also the commander of a trading post. From what Marlo learns, Kurtz appears to be multi-talented and charismatic. However, he's disappointed when he really meets him in real life, and he finds out he is a cruel and egotistical man. He also happens to be insane. Kurtz is leading a group of natives and waging war against other groups to steal their ovary. Marlo also meets a Russian trader and follower of Kurtz, who he calls the Harlequin due to his colorful patched clothing. As it turns out, Kurtz does not want to return home and prefers staying in the village with the natives. However, he is bald, sick, and ill, so Marlo carries Kurtz back to his ship. As they get further and further away, Kurtz's health deteriorates, and Kurtz gives Marlo some letters and a photograph of his fiancée, whom Marlo calls the intended. Marlo also accepts Kurtz's documents and photograph. A day after this, Kurtz is waiting for death. He utters the words, the horror," to Marlo before he passes away. Once he returns to Europe, Marlo visits Brussels, the sepulchral city. He finds himself unable to relate to the sepulchral city because everyone is more sheltered than he is. He eventually meets Kurtz's fiancée, who is still mourning him a year after his death. Like the others, she has an idealized view of him and praises him for his virtues and achievements. She asks Marlo what his last words were, but Marlo doesn't want to hurt her feelings, so he tells her that Kurtz's last word was her name. And then we are going to look at the historical and literary context of this book.
Right. So this book was published in 1899. So the literary current and the style that was in fashion at the time was realism. And we can think, for example, Dickens, because he is what people usually think about when we say realism. So the style is very straightforward and linear, and it is basically the simplest us to understand in terms of language and in terms of narrative structure. The themes, we have a focus on human behaviors and a critique of society. So we have a lot of psychology, but this is mainly in terms of human behaviors and mentalities and interactions with others. But we don't see a lot of in-depth analysis of people's thoughts or their stream of consciousness. This wasn't a thing yet. And with the beginning of the 1900s, we slowly go towards modernism, which is starting to develop. And in many ways, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and also his earlier novel, Lord Jim, are seen as early modernism. So he was one of the pioneers of the genre. And this is very different. This is characterized by a convoluted style, deliberately difficult narratives, and it is also non-linear because writers of modernism believe that non-linearity is much better able to express human experiences because our thoughts are not linear in our heads, and also our perceptions can be quite chaotic. So a modernist tries to reflect this in their style. And in terms of themes, we see a distrust in both human nature and society. So this is not really the way we see in realism, where we see that there is good in people and it's most often prevails after a lot of trials, for example. And so modernism is usually more pessimistic. Mm-hmm. So now let's see how Heart of Darkness shares traits of both realism and modernism. So first of all, realism and how Conrad subverts his expectations. First of all, Heart of Darkness can be seen as a travel narrative, which were very popular at the time. But Conrad's story is not about a place, not about an adventure, not about events, not about the resolution of a conflict, because what the protagonist actually learns is that the world is savage. And in the end, he lies in order to hide it. So he learns to lie, if you will. It is also characterized by a critique on colonialism and social structure. So this would go into the realism with the critique of society. But instead of offering an answer to this, the story shows that people are powerless against the system, and humans, in the absence of laws, become evil, like Kurtz. But the society is also evil because it maintains harmful systems and it sweeps evil deeds under the rug in the name of civilization. And the novel also depicts the ivory trade in Africa, so it could be seen on the surface as a realistic depiction of events happening at the time when it is written. But Conrad's Africa is not the real Africa. It is rather a symbolic place full of absurdity and enigmas. Mm-hmm. As for modernism, we see many more traits here. We see a renewed focus on form, which we remember that we used to see a lot of during Romanticism, but then during realism, form was as straightforward as possible in order that the message can prevail. But here we also see a renewed focus on form, which is deliberately difficult, as we said, with the addition of symbolism, heavy language, careful structure, defined by themes and symbols. So this book starts from themes, not really from plots or from characters. So yes, we see the prevalence of theme over character, and we also see a multi-layered interpretation. So it's not very easy to discern what the book is about. There are several answers to this. It can be a political statement of the evil of imperialism and of racism. Maybe it is a critique of hierarchy and bureaucracy. Maybe it is a statement on the evil of human nature in the absence of society. It could also be a journey into the self, or it could also be a descent into hell, into the heart of Africa and into the heart of colonialism. And also, this book, as are all modernist books, is heroless because the protagonist is not really a hero. And all the characters, there is no clear delimitation between evil and good.
Totally agreed. And our fourth question is about narrative technique. So, The Heart of Darkness is a story within a story, a framed narrative. It also has a double narrator. The real narrator of the story is not Marlo, but actually an anonymous narrator who is listening to Marlo's story, who is observing Marlo as he tells his story. He is hypnotized by what Marlo is saying and seems to be considering him enlightened, since he considers him to be a meditating Buddha. This begs the question, why did Conrad choose an anonymous narrator? It's to illuminate the capacity of words to deceive and confuse, I think. The narrator has difficulty seeing Marlo's face, just like Marlo struggles to understand who Kurtz is, and by extension, what colonialism is, because Kurtz, in a way, symbolizes colonialism.
Right. So to better understand what technique does, let's compare the selective omniscience that we see here in this book, because as we are following Marlo, we only see his perspective, right? Versus a first-person narrative. So if instead of seeing Marlo from the outside, like in an RPG game, if you will, we would have Marlo describing his travels in the first person. Then we wouldn't be able to see him as a meditating Buddha, right? Because we would never see Marlo from the outside. We would never visualize him from the point of view of someone else. So this technique also sheds light on Marlo, thus making him not a stand-in for the reader, which he couldn't be, especially for us nowadays, because our mentalities differ greatly from his own, but a man of his time. And also, now let's compare it to the omniscience. What if we had full omniscience, right? A godlike narrator who shows us the perspective of every character and also explains what's going on. Because now we don't see things that go on in the absence of Marlo. Well, then we wouldn't have Kurtz, because what's brilliant about this character is that we only truly see him towards the end of the book, but we hear about him all throughout. And that's because we only know what Marlo knows. So the selective omniscience is great in creating suspense and shaping characters.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So one of the reasons why Marlo isn't a reliable narrator is because he doesn't align with modern standards. As such, he's not a stand-in for the modern reader, but everything is colored through his perspective. The way he describes the natives really epitomizes this. For instance, he describes Kurtz's mistress as, quote, wild and gorgeous apparition of a woman. He also describes the Africans he encounters as, quote unquote, savages, despite his negative feelings about colonialism. Accordingly, this book has been called racist, since Marlo does not decolonize all of his thoughts. As we will cover later in this book review, he still views Native Africans in a racist light. And, this really sheds light on what R.N. Roveleh just said here about, omniscience versus first person and how Marlo is a man of his time.
Right. Very much so.
Next question is, how does the character of Kurtz strike you? For me, Kurtz is a terrifying man. He looks like a skeleton and looks very surreal, and he's capable of extreme cruelty. He's also charismatic and talented, since everyone, other than Marlo, seems to be under his spell.
He is a very enigmatic character, and the narrative technique helps build him and make him shine. The reader, along with Marlo, learns about Kurtz long before he appears in the novel. And from the accounts of others, he is described in apparently contradicting ways. Like you said, he is shown as a Renaissance man. He is someone who is good at a lot of things. He is seen as very ambitious, and some people believe that he got where he is due to his connections. Other people think that he got there due to his extraordinary skills. So we see both good and bad traits, and we don't really know what to make of this character. But one of the themes in this book is truth. And I love how it's handled in this contradictory aspects of Kurtz's personality, especially in that scene with Marlo and Kurtz's fiancée that you mentioned. When Marlo meets Kurtz, he is actually quite disappointed, right? Because he believed him to be this extraordinary character based on what other people said. But as it turns out, Kurtz is a cruel egomaniac who wants everybody to worship him. So he is much worse than Marlo had imagined. He also seems to be suffering from delusions of grandeur, since he is essentially running a cult in the middle of a jungle. So he's leading a tribe to wage war against other tribes to steal their ivory. Then people still worship him after his death. Right? The intended, for instance, still mourns him a year after his death, as you mentioned, and still venerates him for his achievements and virtues. Mm-hmm. So this is how the truth comes into play here, because Marlo has to hide it.
Yes, he does. And then now we're going to talk about how Kurtz compares to R.N. Roveleh or Helevorn's character, Yngvar. So both of these characters, I would say, are terrifying, but in a different way. Both Kurtz and Yngvar are interested in art and knowledge and existential matters, although it's not what one would expect from people like them. Also, both of them are obsessed with civilizing people, but Kurtz is doing it to another people, while Yngvar is doing it for his own group, the Norse in medieval Norway. Also, Kurtz is able to be charismatic and hold people under his spell, and Yngvar can do that too, but it's for a much better and less self-serving purpose.
That's true. And the similarities decrease as Marlo goes up the river, since during this journey, Kurtz proves to be more and more terrifying, whereas with Yngvar, it's really the other way around. So the reader, through the character of Aidan, who is the protagonist from whose perspective we learn of Yngvar, he learns that Yngvar is much less negative than he initially appears. And the way in which I was inspired by this, by this book, was in the narrative perspective. So this is what I wanted to show. I really love that technique of presenting somebody from the eyes and words of other people, and only then getting to know him. So this is what I tried to do.
Mm-hmm. The sixth question is the Heart of Darkness racist? Although The Heart of Darkness is a critique on colonialism, it can be constructed as racist because Marlo is depicted as someone who doesn't question racist beliefs. Specifically, he doesn't ever seem to critique the view that our Africans are savages, although he dislikes colonialism. He seems to focus more on how Europeans shouldn't be doing colonialism rather than the fact that colonialism is harming Africans. Also, Marlo doesn't see Africans as individual people. He always describes them as a mass of interchangeable people. He recognizes their suffering, but it's always in a very generalized way. Meanwhile, every white person in the book is recognized as an individual. Further, Marlo sees the Congo as an experience, not only for himself as a way to learn more about humanity and truth, but for the other Europeans too, such as the Russian and, of course, Kurtz. Marlo never thinks about Black people's thoughts, only the other white people he's encountered. For Marlo to be less racist, he would see Africa as a place in its own right, where Black people can be protagonists. Unfortunately, Black people are seen as cameos in their own land, while white people are the protagonists who get to decide everything. Kind of like how white American colonialists saw America as, quote, a new land to be discovered, despite the facts that Native Americans were already living there. But then again, the book is from Marlo's perspective and not necessarily a reflection of Conrad himself, since Marlo is a character. As such, it's hard to say whether the book is necessarily racist. Kurtz and Marlo definitely are, though.
Indeed. This is a very dark and pessimistic novel full of very heavy themes. So you aren't supposed to like any of the characters here, as it usually happens with modernism. So this book is extremely conscious of the horrors of colonialism and slavery and the hypocrisy and evil of people. And arguably, the evil in the book is represented by white people and their politics. So you mentioned the land which is discovered. Yes, here Marlo describes Africa as a previously white spot on the map, which is now beginning to catch shape because white people arrived there to map it. But he also says that the arrival of white people darkens it. And we have a scene where white men talk about ivory, and they, and I quote, whispered the word as if they were worshiping it. So it's this corruption and this thirst for money and power and their unscrupulousness, that of the white people, which corrupts Africa. Black people, on the other hand, that they aren't depicted as good either, which is not racist, because the trope of the bon sauvage, of the good savage, as it was called in literary analysis, is just as racist because it is being dismissive of people's motives. And it would be creating a character, a one-trait character. Could there have been a Black character which is actually fleshed out in the book? Absolutely. And I think that this would have enhanced the book greatly if written in the same heavy and brutal manner in which every other character here is written. I would have loved to see how that Black character conceptualized Kurtz and the ivory trade. But the question is, was Conrad truly qualified to speak for Black people? Was Marlo, who did not know any Black people and could not speak the country's language? Conrad and Marlo in the text describe what they know firsthand, the colonialist mentalities of Conrad's time, which were undoubtedly racist. But in depicting the racism, Conrad is pointing it out as a horror. So in this sense, the book is opposite of that. So sure, I always quote Oscar Wilde in situations like this, who said that there is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written and badly written. And this is what I usually quote when people are judging the message of a book.
Right. So what are the flaws of this book? I would say definitely the flowery writing style and the long sentences. A lot of the time, it was hard to understand what Conrad was suggesting or describing. However, it's understandable since English was his third language and he only became fluent in his 20s.
It is quite convoluted. And when it comes to masters of literature like Conrad, I avoid pointing out flaws because authors like this really knew what they were doing. And so this is modernism, which means it's deliberately difficult to understand and convoluted. So it's not for the lazy reader. You have to solve the puzzles and traps that the author lays out. And it is part of the charm, but it's definitely not something you want to read for relaxation and escapism. So you really have to be all in if you want to read this book. So I think it's a wonderful book, but it depends, like you said, in what moment and what kind of mood you are in and what mood you want to be in after you finish it.
Absolutely.
And also the flaw is the potential racism that we discussed, right? But since it has it is embedded in the style with the narrative technique, as we said. So, right.
Exactly. Finally, what's our rating? For me, it's 4 out of 5 stars, or maybe 3 out of 5 when I have a headache, because this does take a lot of energy to read. But generally, this is a very good glimpse into the cult-like behavior of colonialists or, any other cults. And I would have loved to see Marlo deconstruct his thoughts more, but that is really the only critique I have besides, the convoluted language. And I would have liked to see him confront his own racist beliefs. But that might be asking too much since this is a short story and it is from the 19th century.
That's true.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.